Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this latest MEED webinar on the economic challenges and opportunities in the GCC, the current market and near-term developments. My name's Colin Foreman and I'm the editor of MEED, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by David Clifton, Regional Director from Atkins Realis. There's a lot to talk about today. We're going to be talking about really the main key themes and drivers that are affecting the construction market. So we've got a lot to talk about. We have an hour, so let's get started. Quickly before we start, just a couple of slides just to talk about what MEED's been up to recently. We've recently released the Saudi Giga projects report for May 2024, and there's some discount codes and things for people that are attending the webinar to avail from. So I urge you to scan the QR code and take advantage of that, which is really a very comprehensive overview of projects that are going on in Saudi Arabia at the moment, which is arguably the most exciting projects market in the world at the moment. Also, another thing just to be aware of, we are running our awards program again. So at the end of June, on the 28th of June, is the deadline for entries into the awards. There's a range of categories and national winners, and then they go through to the final awards round, which will be held at an event in November. So that's another thing which everyone should be aware of. If you've completed a project and would like to get recognition for that scheme, then please make sure that you enter by the end of June. Right, straight on to the market. David, I will perhaps take the lead here a little bit and just give a bit of a historical perspective. And then we'll move on to what's happening in the market at the moment, and then we'll use your expertise there and also looking forward to the future. I think really if we talk about the last 10 years, it's been one that's been a challenging time for construction and transport, but also one that there's been a lot of things that have been delivered and a lot of achievements that are really worth highlighting. I think if we cast our minds back to the start of 2015, end of 2014, there's been a change in leadership in Saudi Arabia, which has meant a vast deal of difference in the Saudi projects market, notably with Vision 2030 under the leadership of Mohammed bin Salman. And also initially there was the drop in oil price, if we remember, from the end of 2014. So there was that low oil price environment. The market was really sustained on a regional basis by the two main event-driven construction programs. In Dubai, you had Expo 2020, and in Qatar, you had World Cup 2022. In the background of that, there was also some regional tension. So there was the GCC diplomatic dispute, which meant that some of the sort of the more regional schemes that we'd been talking about previously, such as GCC Rail, got put on the back burner. And then, of course, although some of us may have forgotten about it now, we had COVID-19. And perhaps the backdrop of all that would be low interest rates. Would you agree with that summing up of the past 10 years? What do you think would be the key?
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, but the interesting thing around when you mentioned the low oil prices is that the low and high oil price, there was in essence the lag in the awards. So a high oil price, you won't see anything really move the market for sort of 2 to 3 years as finance gets caught up in the bureaucracy and the process the governments have in terms of being able to move that money onto programs or projects. In terms of the larger regional schemes, yes, very much so. The GCC rail network was it was always politically driven as much as it was in needs driven, but the tensions that occurred in recent times would have not helped the situation, to be honest with you. However, in a lot of instances, the movement of goods actually for the GCC rail is a very good thing, because the highway system and the logistics systems that are available within the region, whilst being relatively advanced, they're largely driven around the high-tech state of aviation.
Yep.
And if you're talking about our industry, the ability to move goods is a rather expensive function if you want to do it by aeroplane, but it's a lot more reasonable to be able to do it by taking goods off the road and placing onto the rail network. And also given the huge distances involved, I know you know that aviation is a focus, but of course that's passenger driven in many respects, in the same way that you could argue that Africa missed the landline sector and of telecoms and moved straight onto mobile phone. Whilst we have a good road network, we've kind of moved a little bit more to be aviation related than having to drive anywhere.
I think it's a great point that you made there on time lags. If we just put onto the next slide, we can see construction and transport awards for 2014 to 2024. And I think really there, that graph does show that time lag. I think if we remember, we had a peak in 2013 with the year where a lot of Doha Metro and Riyadh Metro was awarded. 2014 also a strong year, and then it began to tail off, but it didn't collapse overnight, if you remember correctly, and that time lag was really at play then. I think the other interesting thing that happened in that period, the time lag differs between market, doesn't it? I think somewhere like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, the time lag is quite short, as oil and gas it has a much more dominant impact on the economy. And I think Dubai showed that the time lag was the longest. Although ultimately proved to be significant as well.
Although the write-downs for Dubai were quite significant as well for investors or financial institutions. But it's also interesting when you kind of correlate the mannerisms in which central banks and sovereign wealth funds for each country act as well, and also their scale. So if you look at the UAE, if you add up all the sovereign wealth funds, ADIO, Modular, EIA, ADQ, ICD, DP World, Rakia, Shuruk, you're basically getting to just over $2 trillion worth of theoretical collateral firepower. Admittedly, only keep something in the region of 2% of that in liquid form, but there is, and the central bank in the UAE holds $133 billion in liquidity that can be deployed at the express wish of the government. So there is an ability for them to act, but there's a cautiousness about the way in which the UAE will deploy its capital. Whereas if you look at Saudi Arabia, and this is largely population driven, is that there are needs for the local population, whereas the minority, of course, the UAE are Emiratis. So there's a need to fulfil the social contract with housing, with education, with healthcare for Saudi, whereas in the UAE, that's largely taken care of, but they're looking to build themselves as the next economic horsepower on a global level.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point there. I mean, what you're describing, the traditional model, if we go back 20, 30 years of a sovereign wealth fund, was basically a risk adjustment platform, wasn't it? You take in oil revenues and invest it overseas, and that would hedge against any
QIA is a good example of still doing it.
Has that changed over in recent years? I mean, the thing I'm thinking about mostly is PIF, but you see other entities such as Modular, which are investing with more of a sort of a broad economic mandate rather than a financial return. Is that something that we really need to think of as a key change? Certainly in the PIF case, there's an awful lot of activity in the domestic market there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you look at the sovereign wealth funds though, because the PIF's got a very broad, all-encompassing mandate on a global level as well as a local level. And if you look at the sovereign wealth funds such as ADID, ADID is obviously very much an overseas investment vehicle, and Modular historically has been a bit more technology orientated as well, as being somewhat more overseas. But ADID has started to switch more towards what we would call mature markets, such as the G7, where they used to have such 24% of its portfolio in the United States, to being more Eastern focused. We spoke some time ago on a different event in regards to the regional pivot to the east in terms of looking for returns on investment, and also growth areas and certain levels of influence, but also a level of sort of securing maybe their own supply chains as well, buying into refineries in places such as India so that they can sell their oil and help refining it. I mean, these are all examples whereby they're looking to sort of put some more control onto their supply chains and distribute this sovereign wealth influence.
Looking back at the chart for contract awards, we can see that it was effectively a steady decline from 2014 up until 2020. 2020 was obviously the year that COVID really impacted the region. There was a lot of lockdowns and not much in the way of contract award at all. Same for 2021, but then we've seen a strong recovery in 2022 and 2023, one of the best years on record for construction and transport. So really, it's the last decade has really been a story of steady decline, COVID, and then a strong recovery.
Absolutely, and I mean, look, there's when you look at if we could go back further, when you look at certainly for the UAE, we go back to say the Arab Spring in 2011. The UAE is still considered to be a relative flight to safety in terms of capital flight. Maybe less so for those of us that carry certain passports, but there's a lot of countries around the world where UAE is a very safe place in terms of placing their capital. So that will drive interest and investment from a variety of different countries, as we saw the first real big spike post global financial crisis was the Arab Spring, which drove money from North Africa, Syria, and other areas to come and settle itself into the UAE.
Yeah, and in the case of COVID, and the UAE was able to keep itself open or open up quite quickly.
Yeah.
That provided an opportunity for people to come here who quickly found that Dubai does offer a lot of, is an attractive proposition for people wanting to live here. So we've seen that, the stories about high net worth individuals relocating here, setting up offices, and then obviously the Russia-Ukraine conflict and other things have fed into that narrative more recently.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting one looking at that perspective is that there's obviously an ambition for Saudi to try and create an environment of some similarity.
Yeah.
And with the introduction of things such as the company's law, and they're talking about you've got the ability for non-Saudis to buy asset classes in the real estate industry. They're moving in the right direction. There's obviously significant amount of catching up to do, but that will drive the FDI in the future. The FDI targets that we've made the analysis for from the beginning of Vision 2030 today have not been achieved by quite some significant distance, although I do take it from the view from my lunch club that it's aim for the stars and hopefully hit the moon. But with all the changes, and these take time to go through the system, with the ability to freehold, the ability to buy asset classes for others, and the company ownership structures, there is positivity. It's just going to take a while to catch up, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, for construction, stepping back a little bit from that investment story, for construction, I mean, it really was a very good year for Saudi Arabia in 2023. Where do you see the main drivers for that? Is it just the Giga projects, or is it more of an all-encompassing story?
Well, I mean, there always used to be the old adage that it was the Pareto law for Saudi Arabia. 80% of the work came from 20% of the client. 20% of the clients was the government. The inversion has now occurred insofar as that really is largely PIF, or it's 57 real estate organisations that are driving that, including obviously the Giga projects. So that's really the story. But the extra private sector side of things is limited to a certain degree. But I think that there's a lot of focus from the industry purely and only on the sort of the big announcement projects, which everybody's excited quite rightly to be involved in. We are, and we're delighted to be so. But it's driving that other engagement from the rest of the market as well. That's quite critical moving forward. So one of the things that you'd look to do potentially is utilise a model similar to the way that Imar looked at, say, Dubai Marina or downtown. It catalyses the districts through infrastructure, through a keynote asset or some keynote assets, and then looks to capitalise on the land sale post that point. And I think Email 6 and Burj Khalifa and Dubai now are pretty good examples of how they catalyse that.
Is it easy to do that? I mean, there's two comments really on the sort of the Saudi projects that have been launched in recent years. One is the scale.
Yeah.
And two is the sort of the complexity and the ambition that's involved with them. Does that leave much breathing space for other players to come in, or is it? I mean, they've rightly dominated the market over the last few years.
I think it probably does provide a limiting perspective, but it also brings neatly into a conversation that both both KSA, UAE, and since Q22 completed, Qatar is a good example as well. Is that there's a difference between capacity and capability.
Yeah.
So you could argue that the workforce levels, so capacity in Saudi Arabia, are higher, but and notionally only about 10 or 15% higher than they were in 2015. So while we've been going down, the workforce has come back up a little bit, but that's capacity. The capability piece is a different conversation. And the UAE has a similar thing because and Qatar has a similar thing. Once you've completed the Q22 stadiums, infrastructure, and the metro, and the UAE, you finished at Royal Atlantis, and you finished whatever other keynote projects, the capability will often go flying somewhere else. So that as long as we're clear about the two differentials, and that's where I think we have got a little bit of a challenge. When we start to look at some of the complex works that we're looking at to achieve before we go on to capacity, which in Saudi is a different conversation on logistics as well.
I mean, we've alluded to it already, talking about Dubai's performance post-COVID, but I mean, Dubai's really in the midst of another real estate boom, isn't it? I mean, we talk with great fondness of the sort of 2003 to 2008 period. I would argue that for Dubai real estate at the moment, it's a similar kind of period that we're in at the moment.
You'd strongly argue that it's not dissimilar as well. Abu Dhabi.
Yeah,
Abu Dhabi has a lot of strength in that, and also moving forward as the dark horse, of much smaller dark horse, but one that's running is Ras Al Khaimah. But if you were to take a view on the sales that have been published by all of the majors in the UAE, primarily for Dubai and Abu Dhabi, it'd intimate that they would have to award somewhere between 24 and 25 billion US dollars worth of construction contracts before the end of the year if they were to achieve a RERA-based contract delivery period.
Yeah. How much of that is, to use a bit of a phrase, how much of that is just sort of house bashing? I mean, initially it was a lot of villa sales. Is that still very much the dominant subsector?
There seems to be quite the dominant subsector, without question, still largely lingers around townhouses and villas, no question. Although there still seems to be some latent demand in apartments, but the sales of that seems to be a significant slower growth curve than the townhouses, and that goes back largely one to the safe haven investment, but also this is a little bit of a layover from COVID, as well as it being attractive destination to now keep your family. So in COVID we all got locked up. Lots of people got locked up in flats, all decided to go, and now everyone's gone looking, if we're going to invest and we're going to buy a house here and we want to be here for 20 years and bring our family up here, then we need to be looking for a house with a garden. And that's driven the Dubai land scheme that we all saw back in the early 2000s that was first announced, driven the actual move to that. And you've got the investment safe haven. You spoke about the Russian-Ukraine war. We speak about the Arab Spring. There's always something in the global events that's driving a level of where's a safe place to be.
And on top of that sort of home building, is there much activity, say, in hotels, hospitality, retail? Traditionally, we've had quite a lot of project opportunities coming through, and then the sort of the iconic project or infrastructure work.
You look into, there's always a latent demand for looking into hospitality, and we see Abu Dhabi is obviously taking a very proactive view towards it. It's starting to create lifestyle destinations and centres of culture. And it's not necessarily explosive like in the same way that we would have seen back in the boom times. In the transport sector, of course, we've seen Maktoum re-announced, but we've got the Etihad rail link down to Oman coming through very shortly. We've got the Blue Line obviously coming through with the RTA. So there's certainly work there, but the more mature a market becomes, generally speaking, the more steady it will become. So the real estate is obviously a very cyclical market, and we can very strongly argue that we're at the top, if not past the top, of that particular sales platform. It may well have outperformed expectations by most people's standards and continued longer than we thought. But the rest is a relatively steady feasibility-based side of things. Now, in Saudi, if we start to look at that feasibility side of things, what you're quite rightly pointing out is that earlier, which is the events based. So when we're starting to see what we think the focus is about the market, we would certainly suggest that that there is a turn of focus around Winter Games 27, Expo 2030, World Cup 2034, and that supporting infrastructure or asset class that will back into supporting those events, as realistically they're drop dead dates, so other things can actually move.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the capability and capacity question, because capability side of things, some of the schemes that we're involved in as Atkins Rise, and some of the schemes that others are involved in on this call are so complex that we're having to have new ways of thinking about how we're going to do it. And in a certain instances, some of the technology doesn't actually exist. And those are very positive challenges to be given. But that's the capability piece. The capacity side of things, there are some general thoughts that populations of the industry is say 10 or 15% bigger, as I said previously, than back in 2014 or so. But we've got logistical challenges in terms of quantum of things such as materials. So we talk about capability, which is largely people, technology, and system, and then we've got just raw capacity. And if we look at the ports network in Saudi Arabia, for instance, dry bulk, which is how you might bring in aggregate, which they don't really need to do because they've got Marden, but you bring in sort of rebar, something along those lines on these. They've only got 696,000 ton capacity, which sounds a lot, but it's not. And how else do you bring it in? So when we talked about the rail network previously, ideally you'd somehow bring it in through. Well, realistically, you've got UAE or Oman, because Yemen's not a place to go, and Syria and Iraq is not really a place to bring it in from either. So you would ideally have the rail network, but now you're starting to think, how do we utilize the road network? So that's the capacity piece in terms of just plain old-fashioned material and or major pieces of equipment.
I mean, that plays into a trend we've talked about a lot globally across all sectors, isn't it? That sort of supply chain resilience.
Yes.
And if you're a country that's really just fending for itself in terms of its infrastructure, you're not really that well. You're not that resilient. Whereas if you're connected to other countries much more efficiently, the theory is the resilience improves, which is what you're talking about there. If you could utilize the UAE's infrastructure to Saudi Arabia, for example.
It's interesting to know because I mean it's been published widely in the media, but obviously Aldar's committed to invest into Saudi Arabia, and in terms of bringing capital to the table. So that's answers part of the FDI question. But secondly, with that, what else comes with it? I mean, you've got KZ, you've got Jebel Ali, you've got Salalah in Oman, Sohar, and really you have to utilise the road networks, but that becomes suddenly an option, and it's one that needs to be considered and taken on board, really, because it's not just the construction industry that's competing for ports capacity. You've got food security programs for Saudi. That's going to compete for your capacity. You've got just FMCG largely in containers. That's competing for its capacity. So you've got other competing fences here. So you can't just think to yourself, "Oh, we can take all that capacity as the Giga projects," because you can't.
And how quickly can you solve this problem? I mean, obviously, there's sort of regulatory challenges. So, things like customs, border control, which don't require an infrastructure build, but do require resolving some bureaucratic issues. And how much of it's a pure infrastructure problem? For example, you've got to build a railway.
I think with the government side of things, as we've discovered over many years in GCC, where there's a will, there's a way. I think when we talk about building a new port, I know that in this region we like to do everything as a 3-year build contract, but realistically you're going to be 5 to 7 years away before you've got one. And then you start to talk about the rail network. Well, we know that takes time. We've got evidence of the time it takes from looking at Etihad Rail. And whilst that is obviously moving, runs past my house, it's a function of time, and you can't necessarily make it happen any quicker because you want it quicker. And then we go back to the capability and capacity question as well. So is that intrinsically here? And there are challenges from the regional perspective of having that international intellectual protocol IP coming to work here at the moment. We've seen when I first moved here, straight key, pretty much every major international contractor that you could think of was either here or had a representative office here. And that list is a lot shorter now.
How much of that is a concern at sort of, you're talking to your clients about moving projects into construction. How much of that is a concern, or how much is it something that's just not really acknowledged?
Well, I was looking with one particular client, and I'll leave it off the table, but a week or two ago around a collective of complex projects that they had. And for this particular client in this particular country, we listed out 6 organisations we thought could lead it.
Yeah.
That used to be 20 that we thought could lead it. But that again goes back to that capability and capacity. So whilst we're seeing that this year, because of real estate sales, we might see 24-25 billion US dollars worth of main contract award. But that's a capacity challenge, not necessarily a capability challenge.
And how do you solve that problem? Is that how does I mean, does the region need to go on a charm offensive to attract contractors back? Does it need to create its own? I mean, we've seen PIF invest into 4 contractors in Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
We've seen Abu Dhabi take a lot more control, more on a sort of government-related entity basis, but controlling its construction sector a little bit more. Do you create a homegrown solution, or do you bring in, or is it a mix of both? What's the solution?
I don't think there's a perfect answer to any of those questions. I mean, in an ideal world, it would become more of a mix again. I mean, one of the standout things for me in terms of how to pull together a joint venture was Burj Khalifa with Samsung, B6 and Aerotech. We all know what each one brought to the table, and that was, let's face it, successful insofar as one outstanding project. So that type of thinking is erstwhile. And yeah, you have looked at the fact that PIF bought 30% of Nasma Al Saif Al Bawan in Abu Dhabi. Is that always the right idea? You can argue your case both sides of the fence really easily. But in ownership of Abu Dhabi owning contractors, Dubai owning contractors, again, it gives you kind of a closed loop in terms of knowing that specialist expert contractor is going to work for you, but it's not necessarily great for the rest of the market, because what we're seeing, as it is, we're seeing with these mergers and acquisitions from the developer standpoint, we're seeing a narrowing of the market anyway. So it's not a broad market. If you take top 4, we're probably talking about 80% pipeline in the real estate market for this year and next, I would have thought. And that's a fair assessment based on their sales figures and what that translates to in numbers on the ground. So yeah, it's the narrower the market, generally you'd say the less competitive it will get.
And I mean, traditionally, one of the big complaints about the region has been, poor payment terms, and that's one of the contributing factors to construction companies exiting the region. Is that something that's improving? Is that a conversation that clients are having about trying to resolve some of those issues to make the region more attractive for companies to work?
There are some that are doing a very good job right now, to be honest with you. We've got some of the organisations that we work with that are paying rather effectively. And are pretty reasonable organisations to deal with and people that you want to work with. But there's still culture in certain parts of the region that is, as I used to call it, the master-slave situation, where I'm going to beat you up, and then you're lucky to work for me even if I'm not paying you. And there is still, that culture hasn't disappeared. It's less than it was when I first arrived on these shores, but it's still considered to be a bit of a challenge. And trying to agree fair and reasonable contract terms. I still remember one of the major projects in Saudi when we first fired up, and the then new to the region, the then CEO came to visit me and said everyone's going to work, all the biggest people in the world are going to come here. And I did sort of say, unless it's fair and reasonable contract terms, paying on time, fair and reasonable variation assessments, and that you are dealing with them in a fully professional manner. And you can agree something like different working terms because you want to build it so quickly. It might be 4 on 2 off on a gas type rotation. I'd be surprised if they all came.
Is fixed price lump sum tendering still the dominant form of procurement? And are we seeing other forms of procurement creeping in to try and resolve some of these sort of capability and capacity challenges?
There's been a lurch towards the concept of PPP or similar. I urge, if anyone's interested, to look up the Canadian Ministry's graph. It's Canadian Ministry's graph of PPPs. It explains broadly, for anybody who doesn't fully understand, the different grades going from traditional through to full concession and operation. But everyone's trying to move in that direction, partially or fully. And the recommendation would only be to put a third of your portfolio in that direction. There's a little bit of confusion about being all or nothing. So instances. And like we're going to do all of our airports, all of our railways, all of our schools and PPP. Probably not worth doing. The layover from building schools for the future in the UK indicates it doesn't work.
And for things like sort of the iconic projects that are coming through in Saudi Arabia, which probably wouldn't go down the PPP route, but they'd look at something, say, an early contractor involvement.
Oh, it's very much a popular conversation, and should be as well. And the early contractor involvement is without question occurring, especially because when we talk about that capability piece, that is where you are trying to bring in global experts to work with like consultancies such as our business, and also with clients such as the PIF 57 real estate companies. Although there's still a notion of somebody wanting a lump sum on the table. Yeah. Because they want that sort of surety. And bearing in mind the complexity and scale and the never having been done before side of things, I would suggest that the quantum of organisations that could take that or would take that on as a risk profile, it will be very limited.
Yeah. And are there much examples in the way of early contractor involvement resulting in contract award? There's a couple I can think of in Saudi.
Yeah, I mean, we compare some notes for this one, but we've seen obviously NEOM's avoiding 100 odd contractors on differing profiles to look at different parts of the delivery process.
Is that the sort of framework?
Yeah, but it's then sort of, because it's a bit of a show and tell from their side, because when you're looking at the international market, what certainly Saudi has to be cognizant of is it's a very much a sales pitch to them as well, because there's a lot of contractors that burnt very hard over the last 20 or 30 years in Saudi Arabia and have left and don't want to, and some of them don't want to come back.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a charm offensive, which we've seen being doing. But also, if you're building something very technical, you may need to go to Korea to speak to the Samsungs and the Huaweis and Sangyongs of the world, because they're technically capable of being able to look at it and go, that's going to be really hard to do, chaps. Yeah. Or that is going to be so expensive for you to do if you thought about doing it this way. So there is certainly, it's a very much better environment engaging, not just with international contractors, but actually international supply chains at an earlier stage as ideas start to come out. I mean, if you're going to build a large structural steel building, engage with the large structural steel organisations that can help work out if it can be appropriately delivered, for a fair and reasonable sum of cash, or if it's going to be extortionate, or if it even can't be done. Yeah.
Last point on this slide was the return of inflation. So I'd like to ask you about what the cost implications are for the amount of work, and then we'll move on to the next slide, because that takes us into future.
So there's a couple of distinctive things here. When you look at CPI, consumer price index inflation in the GCC, I tend to use this as a non-bellwether, quite frankly, because if we take Saudi, they have 450 data points, which 200 price fixed. So you're artificially controlling inflation. Similar in UAE. When we look at construction inflation, we've seen some real divergence. So in the UK, we've seen it running between 5, 6, 7%. In Saudi, it's really 7 to 10, dependent on type. But looking at the sensitivity analysis in inflation in the construction industry, when we look into Saudi, we've got a lot of sentiment-driven analysis when we talk about sensitivity, upper ranges and lower ranges. So you can see sensitivity analysis running at 25% or running at 6%. In terms of contracts awarded, the inflation stands at the sort of reading the 7 through 10s last year and this year today, but that's still significant. And there's still a lot of perception that whilst we had a very good year last year, we'll probably have a pretty damn good year this year. But it's as we start to refocus on the drop dead dates in 27, 30, and 34, and we talk about that logistical capability and capacity, where do we divert our attention to? Because if you can't get it in, it doesn't really matter how many people you've brought in to build it. Yeah. And so that's driving inflation by that factor. When we look at the UAE, because of the mergers and acquisitions, there's a very strong chance that the full big conglomerates they are now may well drive their own sentimental inflation. so perception that there's more and more work coming from them, and then it becomes, how do you control that? That's the narrowing of the market rather than the broadening of the market. So it makes it harder to control inflation factors at that level, because does anybody, if you're a supplier of materials, I'm sure there's many on this call, do you really mind if the contractor's buying them for Aldo or buying them for the buy holders?
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I was going to mention it with Saudi, but you've also raised the question with the UAE: is inflation just a nationwide inflation rate, or does inflation change depending on the project and the? And one phrase I've heard in Saudi Arabia is this concept of neon inflation, and pricing is slightly different in neon. You've just mentioned in the UAE there might be certain bodies within the UAE that pay a higher price.
Well, that's a thought. The UAE's, because of the recent mergers and acquisitions that have occurred, can create their own mini whirlwinds, basically, because they have so much going on, and they've probably got a preferred supply list and all the rest of it. So people will start to realise that, okay, well, we can charge a bit more, but also when it's all factored into one area, essentially you only have to deal with a finite amount of organisations. Whereas if you've got a broad brush of organisations, it may be that at one point you had a really great relationship with Nikhil, but not such a great relationship with Buy Properties, or a really good relationship with Adnic, but not really with Green Investments. They're all one place now.
Yeah.
And so you've kind of got that. You've got a lot of sentiment around markets there. And in Saudi, there is very much a case for different inflationary factors for different schemes. We did quite a bit of work. We've got a very extensive team in Royal Commission of Aula. We did some quite extensive supply chain studies and analysis during the course of last year, as well as sensitivity analysis, inflation analysis, capacity analysis. And part of the reason that you find the inflation is because the cost of setting up an operation there, especially for a contractor, is quite significant.
And is that a logistical thing? I mean, some of these locations are quite remote, aren't they? So you need to set up your supply chain in a remote area. How much of it is that logistics piece, and how much of it is other factors?
Well, if you can deliver $1 billion scheme in Riyadh and make a 5% margin, or deliver $1 billion scheme in Aula and make a 5% margin, which scheme would you want to take?
Yeah, the Riyadh's the easier one if you're established. So
again, that's driving the inflation, because the effort has to be worth the reward.
Yeah.
In the same way that we see pay inflation for staff at different scales in terms of different locations across the region. Because if you want someone to go and work in NEOM, on the ground in NEOM, they're going to be paid more than they would do for sitting in the office in Dubai. And that's just a function for everyone that's having to deal with this industry. So that's where you do see variance and volatility in inflationary pressure dependent on location and project type. But there's also this level of reputational side of things as well, because we all know that it's good clients, we know it's not good clients. Yeah. And so for not good clients, they may not get people to actually tender for them. And if they do, then there's a good chance that the estimation team pricing it will want a premium for it, or their management team will want a premium for it.
And then, I mean, we're talking about a market really that's heating up, or in some cases you could argue is overheated. Certainly Saudi government officials have talked about this being a problem and an issue for delivery. And in recent months, there's been this message coming through that they need to phase projects to try and take some of this heat out of the market. On the flip side, there's some commentary that's saying that, it'll also reduce the capex or the funding burden. How do you see that playing out over the next year or two in terms of phasing?
Both statements are actually quite correct.
Yes.
But likewise, I'll go back to the capability capacity statement, and then we'll also look at the prioritization statement in terms of we've mentioned about the drop dead dates, Winter Olympics, Asian Winter Olympics 2027 Jeddah, Expo 2030 in Riyadh, and World Cup 2034 across the kingdom. These are dates that aren't going anywhere, but even if you had the capability and the capacity from a manpower and technology perspective, you're probably struggling a bit on the logistics perspective to do all of that and then load up more. Yeah. So there are, and when you look at, of course, the funding, I mean, it's well known that the foreign reserve currency reserves are shrinking quite rapidly over the last few years in Saudi. But likewise, they've got a lot of strong investments overseas now. but it's a bit more of a measured approach starting to look like it's being taken. And those drop dead dates are going to have to become the focus because they don't.
And is there an opportunity there to unlock the market more by, say, introducing a freehold law such as Dubai did in 2003, just to bring in a lot more FDI very quickly, as on a more sort of retail level rather than the institutional level?
Yeah, well, on the retail level, that's something you can see that they're aspiring to. I think that the freehold law will move. I mean, they're moving into the overseas ability to own assets classes already.
Yeah.
Which was a big sea change over the last few years, anyway. But when we look at moving it forward, but the challenge they've got, of course, is social contract is that if you are like Dubai and you've got a freehold law and we can buy a house here, but we haven't built enough houses. The inverted problem in Saudi Arabia is not having enough housing for the Saudi nationals. Then you've got a bit of a challenge if you start then selling lots of nice houses to overseas investors. Yeah, there's a perception problem there. Whereas in the UAE, where there's approximately 9 million expatriates, 1 million Emiratis, that's less of an issue because of the scale, the way the population weights work.
Before we move on to the Q&A section, there's one point there which I think is really important, which we haven't really touched on: aviation. Two of the world's biggest airport projects now in the region. We've got King Salman International Airport at Riyadh and Maktoum International Airport in Dubai. Part of a bigger aviation story. What's your summary of aviation and what should we be looking out for?
I mean, they're exciting projects, but I'm always interested to track down the funding mechanisms to make this work. I know that previously when we looked at Maktoum, the export credit agencies collectively, UK, France, Italy, they're all interested. So there is a level of that. But I mean, phenomenally interesting. And I mean, we do sit at a nice pivot point in the global makeup of things. Not being an expert, particularly in the actual aviation organisation, we do question that now you've got people like Qantas wanting to fly point to point from Australia to London. The hub and spoke methodology may or may not prove to be having much longevity. But you know, Emirates is a phenomenal airline. That's why a lot of them live here. Because we can get anywhere in the world. And in Saudi, I mean, having been through the airport many hundreds of times over the years, I think Riyadh can do with a new airport. On scale, I don't know. I think the phased approach is going to have to come into play in due course on it.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to this. I always refer to it as a Gordian knot, isn't it, in terms of Dubai Airport? The problem with Dubai Airport is it's so successful as a hub, it needs to move in one go effectively. Yeah. So that means you need to build the world's biggest airport in one shot, which is quite difficult to achieve. There is a possibility of phasing it, but I don't think that's the preferred route. And if we look at the statement that they announced a month or so ago about the new airport design, they said that everything from DXB would move to Al Maktoum in 10 years, which is a major challenge. And I think also from the Dubai point of view, Dubai's established itself as the leading hub in the world for aviation. I think if they want to maintain that position, there's people like Riyadh that are looking to challenge them. If they want to maintain that position, they do have to invest in infrastructure. So I think there's quite a lot of work that will be coming out from aviation. And on top of that, as you mentioned earlier, there's these sort of regional airports in Saudi Arabia, additional expansions, Qatar. So we'll now move to questions. If we can get the Q&A open on the screen. Okay, we've got a question here which is on modular construction in Saudi Arabia and asking for some commentary on profit margins for modular. Is that something you have visibility?
There's in Saudi at the moment, there's been limited modular engagement. There's a lot of enthusiasm around it, and I still remember going with on various different tours some years ago with MOD housing and looking at places like Singapore and UK for modular. I think there's a massive market for it, but I think margin will come down to the tolerance levels, because modular by and large will end up probably being slightly more expensive because of the way we build things here. So you have to, the view on modular will I don't have specifically, but I know that there's a very strong enthusiasm for it, and it's worth engaging, especially with the larger PIF projects in Saudi Arabia.
Mhm. Before we move on to the next question, a question for you, the audience, which is from us at MEED, and basically, how would you like us to call you to understand how we can support your business? So really, there's a couple of options there. So it's meed.com, MEED projects, and then it's reports, events, and also marketing solutions. So that poll question is there up for you now on your screen. Another question, David, which I'd like to throw to you, which we did have on the slide, but we ran short of time a little bit, is that idea of environmental performance, sort of ESG really. How much of that's going to be a factor going forward? Obviously, we had COP28 in Dubai last year, a lot of talk about the environment. We're seeing a lot of major projects that are very carbon intensive going ahead. How much is that going to change the way projects are developed and planned?
No, now look, I mean, as a business, we're committed to net zero, and a lot of work that we're doing with clients is to try and move very strongly into that sustainability mode. When it comes to financing, say for instance for ESG, I met with several of the big international banks when COP28 was over here, and they were all over the US and UK. They're very interested in green finance, not necessarily ESG finance for schemes, because they don't believe it's embedded hard enough yet into the region. So I think there's a strong motivator for the client side to be starting to drive this a lot harder. And yes, they are very carbon intensive, and and our teams are working quite hard to work out how to reduce that implication. But if you were looking to fund that, big international banks aren't necessarily as very enthusiastic. If you're looking at more VC, venture capital, or PE, private equity solutions, if you want to fund through that model.
And are the banks or even contractors, I know cases of several contractors pulling back from bidding for projects that really didn't fit their sort of carbon profile. Is that something that you're starting to see as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, every single time we look at an opportunity or a project, we are actually looking around, is there a sustainability angle that we can bring something to the table for? And we're very similar in many respects to some of those large contractors, and especially when you start to look at international supply chains, we go back to that capability side, the capability capacity conversation. The capability has started because it's big international firms started to become much stronger in that ESG space. So inherently, it's not necessarily the world coming here wanting to bid on everything. Is, as we discussed with Neil, having to go out and do roadshows and to try and get people interested. You're going to have to start being a little bit more clued into net zero and ESG for a lot of involvement from major international corporates, because they've got their own policies, procedures, and a lot of them are stock market listed with their own ESG credentials for the stock markets.
You made a comment there earlier, you said there's a lot of interest in green in the region, but I assume that means that the S and the G parts of the social and the governance isn't so much of a driver. Is that something that may be going to change, and why isn't it?
This was in the detailed conversation. This was very much Chatham House set of conversations that I had, but it was evident that a lot of them said, well, give me a call if you hear about like green bonds. I mean, PIF's put out a green bond already this year, but they're very interested in that type of world, and with that you can extrapolate that to sustainable buildings, or you can extrapolate that to renewable energy, green hydrogen. I mean, we're really pretty much seeing an epicenter location of making green hydrogen work, which is a phenomenal opportunity as well for the whole industry. But there's the whole ESG piece, and it was one of the real big guys. It was there MEED and economics, and they were saying that green would do full ESG. We're not interested, but there's still a lot of interest, and a lot of this will end up being driven a little bit by a lot of major multinationals. Again, we go back to that capability piece, because a lot of companies may or may not choose to engage.
Yeah, and if you need them to deliver the project, you're going to have to eventually address that issue.
Correct.
Yeah. Question here, which is one that I would like to tackle because it's something that interests me, which is any reflections on the new Iraq railway project, also involving Turkey, Qatar, and the UAE? I think that's the regional rail question, and the fabled link between the GCC and Europe. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I mean, in the principles are it's quite quite a good idea, but it becomes really largely due to distance involved, a little bit more around heavy rail goods, as far as I'm concerned, because we've got such buoyant aviation sector that, as with the argument that Africa skipped the landline generation, moves to the mobile generation, we're sort of skipping a little bit of the passenger rail, skipping a little bit of the road system, and moving to the airports. And it's because some of the distances that are involved in getting around make it viable in terms of transit time to more viable to use plane. I mean, if you're traveling from London to Edinburgh, you could strongly argue that it's touch and go, unless you happen to live near the airport, touch and go as to whether it's quicker to catch a train or not. Probably more expensive to catch a train, but that's a problem for the government. But the time-wise, there won't be much in it. But if you want to try and get high-speed rail from here to Jeddah, the plane will beat you every time.
And in terms of the goods, I mean, for example, if there was a rail link to, say, Turkey, which has got a large industrial base, how much would that help solve some of the sort of supply chain challenges we were talking about, Saudi Arabia and delivering Giga projects?
I think in general, in terms of resiliency, that's a good idea, because I mean, the more I know we've seen the globalization become more localization, but there is still a lot to be said, certainly for material of any description, be that food material or construction material, for being better interconnected, both on a port and a rail system.
Okay, another question, which is about the job market and how much do the projects that we've been talking about affect the job market? I mean, you're a large company, the people-based business.
Of course. Well, we're seeing if you're in the consultancy side of the business, life is quite busy, and we're starting to see that start to pick up through contracting and supply chain side of things. In terms of job opportunities, it rather depends where you sit in terms of capability, capacity. So capacity, volume is required with individuals to deliver it with these schemes. The capability is obviously, if you're highly skilled in a particular area, the demand profile for you will always be there at a point in somewhere in the world. So that tends to be the more upward, that tends to be the more mobile characters. But the jobs market is pretty buoyant, and it will continue that way, especially when we speak about the fact that Saudi is likely to end up with a similar sort of award program that it had last year, even with the challenges. And the UAE we've just discussed, just in the real estate market, we're seeing $24-25 billion just based on the sales profiles that needs to be awarded this year, which if we go against the figures from last year, you were at 39, I was about 42 billion. So a margin.
How much is the market changing in terms of how people are hired? I know that Saudiization and Emiratization and other localization programs are going on in the region. And then also there's that challenge to try and train people up and attract new graduates. Is that changed?
What's quite reassuring is that a lot of organisations have got a strong graduate trainee program. We certainly do. Cohort of Saudi graduates have joined us in this intake. But also one of the things that we're trying to do, I can only comment for myself, is we're trying to engage with schools now. Trying to get schools interested in STEM. Ideally to attract us to us in the future, but certainly for the benefit of our industry. And that's something I'm personally very passionate about, getting into the school side of it. But in terms of the jobs market, I think we're in a position whereby compound annual growth rate realistically is going to be somewhere between 5 and 7% for the next 4 or 5 years, just from the run through the programs that we've got before we add anything else to the pot. So by definition, there'll be need for more people. And so that, but in terms of individual job markets and individual skill sets, I couldn't tell you.
Okay, there's one question here, which is an interesting question. It's saying, is there enough scale in Saudi projects that they might adopt lean methods, or does adopting lean require higher capabilities than they have?
Probably almost answered the question at the moment. It's attracting that capability, to be honest. And the answer to the question is yes, they should. The answer to the question is, will they? I believe that there's certainly conversations to be had. Right now, I don't believe that a conversation wouldn't be had about any possible solution. I think if you've got something sensible, it's going to bring some value to the table, that especially if it's slightly new or innovative, because some of the things that they're looking to achieve have been done before. So we need to think of new ways to do it. Then I think that people will engage. I don't think anything will be written off right now.
Yeah, I know certainly when I visited NEOM, one of the key messages that I came away with, that they're very keen on adopting new methodologies of delivering projects. And the thing that they were particularly keen on is that NEOM is such a scale that you can build up critical mass and to develop that capability on their project, which gives an investor in technology, for example, that pipeline of work.
Well, this is quite interesting because not that long ago, PIF's Real Estate Centrally set up a Centre of Excellence. And the Centre of Excellence is what's new, innovative that we can do, but by scale. And what are we doing really well? For instance, on NEOM that we could put onto the Red Sea or something such that. So aggregation of that data information. So it is interesting. So when you're looking at all those new technologies, they do have a hub for that now at the centre, but they also have them obviously at their own Giga and mega project level.
Okay, another question which is related a little bit to manpower, but also contracting capability. Are you expecting a shortage of specific professionals and subcontractors, and how are people planning to mitigate this?
Again, we go back to capability and capacity. So even baseline capability for relatively simple things might not have the intrinsic capacity.
Yes.
To be able to, how do you get that? So it might be that we might have the capability for structures, but the capacity we don't have because we can't get enough rebar. So that becomes a slightly different conversation. For the very specialist side of things, as I've already said, there's a lot of go-to-market activity, trying to find out new innovative ways. And as I said, in Saudi, PIF has set up the Centre of Excellence now. And they're looking at how do we refine that out to be a hub for everything that should be good, and where can we deploy it elsewhere.
Right, two-pronged question. Do you expect the pace of renewable energy projects will reduce in Saudi Arabia?
No.
Okay. Any basis on that? Just to expand on
because
that.
I mean they have finally fallen in line around 2050 net zero, having previously, because the minister dodged it for 2060. I think his logic must have been something like everyone else failed at 2050, so we don't have to worry about 2060. I don't know. I'm not sure. I was being facetious there, by the way, but I still expect them on the solar side of it. And one of the things that's picking up my train of thought on all of this is that I've been speaking with parts of Oman around the green hydrogen side of things, and Saudi won't miss that trick. And this part of the world is perfectly located by geographics as well as conditions for green hydrogen.
The second part to that question is, do you think there will be funding trouble after 2025 in Saudi Arabia that would delay the development?
I think it's more around the focus, to be honest with you. If you look at Saudi's intrinsic debt to GDP at a sovereign level, there's nothing really to worry about. You look at the peers in a G7, they've all got a higher debt to GDP ratio. I think availability of cash is likely to be partially problematic, but we've already seen them in the bond markets for two bonds at $11.5 billion at the back end of last year, which got deployed in February, which were run by JP and Citi. So I reckon that they can go back to the market. I mean, one of the things that they're looking to do, which is evident now, is looking for, with the creation of companies law, so they're turning these organisations, these Giga projects and other entities into standalone companies, so that they want assets to produce revenue, or they want you to buy assets, generate revenue. Why? Because then there's an LLC you can borrow against the asset and the operational revenues.
And one other question, what is the future and potential of PPP transportation infrastructure projects in the GCC? I think two things there are aviation and rail.
Really? Yeah. Although actually there's a big focus around education programs as well with Tower.
There's also road, isn't there? There's a PPP road. So the PPP road going ahead at the moment.
The demand's trying to float out the PPP for the education sector as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
this question was on transportation.
I know. I'm just saying the PPP in general is broader, but it's primarily driven around rail and aviation. But The one model that seems to keep cropping its head up is, of course, running out of the Gakas, the Jedcos, the Batarats, etc., which is really the aviation sector in Saudi.
And a good case point, there's Medina Airport, isn't there, which was developed on a PPP basis. So
yeah, there was one.
Yeah, and is being expanded as well. So there's a good pioneer project there to show that PPP does work on airports. Rail, I think, is still question open there. I think there's still some misgivings over that making rail work as a PPP.
Yeah, I mean, I think if they're going to do it, they might do it for the new line. They might consider it for the new line at Riyadh Metro if it goes forward.
And one more. What are your views on why KSA is struggling to attract sizable, sustainable volumes of FDI, and how might they address these restricting factors?
Good question, Matt. I mean, there's certainly this perception, a big one, because we spoke about earlier. If you look at, say, the retail level, the UAE is seen as a flight to safety. Freehold on asset classes is allowed here. I don't necessarily think that the FDI they were looking to attract, most of it was going to be into Giga projects. And the Giga projects aren't necessarily set up in the same way as you'd have if you look at, say, an EMA or Dubai Holdings or an Alda or a Q or a Damac or something like that. They're not geared that way. And so that becomes slightly less attractive. And there was a story when well-known international businessman, if you know golf, you'll know him. He's not a golfer, he just owns a golf company. And he came over and we met him, and he went up to one of the Giga projects, came back and went, they're not ready for this. And his family's worth $65 billion, and the fact that he came back, he was well up for it. And that's largely the function is they're set up as a delivery company, as a bringing an asset to the table, whereas an EMA or Dubai Holdings or someone in more mature is set up to deliver an asset in a time frame for a set amount of money that then they hand over the keys to, and that person owns that asset.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Dubai Marina, so let's talk about that one specifically. If we go back to what happened with Dubai Marina, EMA did the actual marina, the waterway, and then the original towers, and then it was like let everyone else step in and do the rest. And we saw similar things, say at Business Bay, JLT, build a couple of buildings, get critical mass going, and then let others come in and build.
And that's really one of the other failovers that we've got here. There isn't anything to hang your hat on. So if you're going to come in, and let's just say you want to build a 5-star hotel in Neom, and you want to be the investor into that, you kind of need to have the infrastructure there already, because promising me it's there, will be there by the time it's done. This region hasn't got a strong history of always hitting the exacting deadline. And so, I mean, just look at the PwC annual reports when they publish about how much of big projects are on over budget or over time. Part of the function is setting a realistic budget at the time, but that's another function of region. But telling an investor, like say, businessman, you'll have the infrastructure will be delivered by the end of 2027. I don't believe he'd believe it. And if it's not ready by the end of 2027, my hotel is ready by the end of 2027. What are you going to do about it? And that's the surety of the investment proposition, and you need to be very sure. That is a challenge when they've been looking at how do you get real estate infrastructure investment in. And really, that's what you're talking about there, is that giving more visibility for what the demand will be, because if there's no infrastructure connecting you up, the demand can't access your asset. And that is a major challenge. I mean, and looking from the outside in, and my cousin's just retired as a CEO of one of the monster real estate advisory organisations, and he's saying, looking from the outside in, it just looks chaotic. So from an investment perspective, or for the FDI, whilst you've been out on a charm offensive, this guy with 4 years experience in the industry, and he's saying it looks a bit chaotic. Yeah, and I suppose looking at the positives of what's going on in the market, you're seeing some of that chaos being controlled a lot more, aren't you? You're seeing a lot of prioritisation. That's exactly what we were just saying at the beginning. So now we've started to see a rezoning of, we've got drop dead dates to look at, and we need to get operational assets, either by an M&A process or by delivering the operational asset. That's quite reassuring, and that will drive knock-on interest, but likewise, you need to have the freehold laws firmly in place, because people don't want to perceive that the money is at risk, especially when you're in competition with the UAE, where it's a more mature market. And then the other point of principle as well for FDI is, what's the yield? Because the yield is going to have to be disproportionately higher than putting in the UAE for safe flight to safety character. So if you're going to make 7% in the UAE, Saudi's going to be looking at 11 or 12.
So I think that's maybe a good point to end on. I think really it's a challenge, but it's also a great opportunity, isn't it, to deliver infrastructure, deliver projects, and build up the.
We definitely live in an exciting time. Certainly more so than from an actual construction activity perspective. Consultants have been busy for quite a few years now, but from a construction activity perspective, we live in an exciting time. It's been flattish or declining-ish for the last 7 or 8 years, and then we're starting to see a curve coming back up, and there's lots of positivity for the entire industry. With that, don't let the perception blow your mind that there's suddenly going to be $2 trillion on the ground by the end of next summer, and that's not functionally possible. But there is a lot of excitement, there's a lot of interest, and there's a lot of great schemes to get involved in right now.
Yeah, and like always, construction's real boots on the ground, economic activity, and okay. Thank you very much, David.
Absolutely, quite an interesting point. Now, we represent roughly across the Kingdom and the UAE, roughly, because it's to give the exact figures, about 7% of GDP, but we actually represent nearly 25% of the employees.
Yes, yeah.
So we're a very important part of the ecosystem.
Yeah. And with that fact, thank you, David.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We tried to answer all your questions. I apologise we didn't get to all of them due to time, but thank you very much for watching.